Okay, so what we were talking about yesterday, we were going through the components of an effective thesis statement, and this was a sample where we left off. We are dealing with the sample question. Let me back up just a second to remind ourselves of what was going on here. So we have the sample prompt, and we're going to use this same sample prompt for the rest of this to look at contextualization and to look at the body paragraphs and all of that. The sample here was to analyze the extent to which the 7 Years' War marked a turning point in American relations with Great Britain, analyzing what changed and what stayed the same from the period before the war to the period after the war. So this was a continuity and change kind of a question, and I just briefly went through how I kind of approached how I might make a thesis. Since this is a continuity and change, a good idea is to think about, list, brainstorm what is the same, what is different. And so I kind of made myself a list of, okay, what was the same between the British government and the colonies? Well, the colonies were still self-governing. They continued to smuggle. They still disrespected and disregarded British authority. What was different? Well, Britain is exerting more authority. They're taking on a much bigger role. They're trying to control the colonies. And overall, their relationship is much more strained and hostile. We had all these different laws and things that showed that. So I decided that I was going to take the approach, I was going to make the argument that there were more differences after the war than there were before it, after the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War. And so I translated that into a thesis like this. What I did was I took some of these specific laws, I'm going to use that as my evidence. I'm going to frame my argument around that evidence to suggest that it was more of a change than it was the same. So this is where I left it. This is my thesis. Changes in British policy after the French and Indian War, such as the Proclamation of 1763, resulted in the American colonists continuing to defy and show little disregard for British authority. However, the passage and the colonial responses to the Stamp Act and Tea Acts demonstrate a massive change in American relations with the British government, as the colonists actively demonstrated against British authority. So I'm saying that, yes, there was some continuity. Things like the Proclamation of 1763 show a little bit of continuity, whereas mostly there was change. I'm using Proclamation of 1763, Stamp Act, and Tea Act as my categories. Those are going to become my body paragraphs. And notice also this is an X, A and B. However, A and B, therefore Y. Here's X. Okay, although we have this, we have A and B, this and this, therefore Y. Therefore, there is a massive change in the way that this relationship unfolded. Notice this is 2 sentences. Thesis statements can be more than 1 sentence. I think 2 is a good maximum. It could possibly be 3. I think when you go into 3, you start running the risk of rambling on and on. If you can't say it in 2 sentences, then maybe you're not saying it correctly, or maybe you're saying too much. So I kind of think 3 is pushing it, in my opinion. But sometimes it can be done in 2. Sometimes it can be done in 1. A lot of the time I do them in 1. I tend to do 1 more than I do 2, but it can be 2 sentences like this one here. Okay. All right. So let's talk about contextualization. You get a point in the way this breaks down. There's what's called contextualization. That's an important thing. Contextualization is a fancy way of saying kind of what came before. Okay. So this. Generally, the contextualization is about the first 3 to 4 sentences of the essay prior to the thesis. This is what builds you up to your thesis. And what the contextualization does is it sets the stage. It sets the scene. It paints the moment. It gives us the background. Perhaps a more friendly word for you than contextualization is background. Okay, it is what leads up to the events, the changes, the whatever it is that you are discussing throughout the rest of your essay. It is the backstory, and then you go into your thesis. So it should include information about what came before. Think about what came before, generally about 20 years, although you could go maybe as much as 50, but I wouldn't go beyond that. This is the what came before, and you just need, like I said, 3 to 4 sentences about what came before all of this, and then you drop into your thesis. This is like a good analogy that hopefully most of you will understand. It's kind of like Star Wars. How does every Star Wars movie start? Before that. Okay, and then what? The The scrolling, right? Okay, every Star Wars movie starts with the scrolling of the text, and it's really 3 sentences, isn't it? And what does that do? What does that part do? It sets the story, doesn't it? It says, here's what's going on, and then bam, it drops you in the story. That's what contextualization is. So think of this as, that famous, rolling text in Star Wars. You got to set the scene, all right? Now, the thing you do have to make sure you're doing, though, this can't just be random stuff. It can't just be random stuff that's not related to the actual essay. So, for example, again, I'm using this example about the French and Indian War and how that changed the relationship between the colonies. My contextualization could not be, long time ago, there were Native Americans in America, and then the Europeans come over and colonized, and now we got 7-year war. Okay, that's too far away. And that's not related necessarily. So it's got to be closely related to exactly what's in there. So it cannot be random facts. You can't go too far outside the time period. You got to relate it to the question. So for example, that's what I was saying there. It must be immediately relevant, must be immediately relevant to the essay topic. So it can't just be random facts. It can't be super vague. It's got to be related to that topic. So in this case, it's got to be related to something with the relationship between the American colonists and the British government. There's got to be a relationship there. So what I've got down here, here's the contextualization that I wrote for this particular one. So I wrote, until the end of the French and Indian War in 1763, the American colonists and British government enjoyed a peaceful and practical relationship with strong cultural and economic ties. The British government and the American colonies both benefited from the policy of salutary neglect and prospered due to their powerful trade connections. However, the French and Indian War forced several changes to this arrangement. And then, bam, there I go my thesis, which I had on the previous slide about, some things stayed the same, but then this and this showed that it became very, very different. So notice this is kind of before, this kind of sets up what was going on before that relationship changed. This is kind of how it was before it changed, but it directly relates to it. I don't get super vague just saying, okay, there were colonies and stuff happened. We want to avoid those kind of things, okay? All right, so you have contextualization and you have a thesis. All that happens in your introductory paragraph, okay? So that's, and I'll talk about the rubric last, but the way this is set up point-wise, 2 of the points come from just that right there. So if you do that, you do those things well, you're well on your way to a good score. But you got to have your content and you got to know what to do with your body paragraphs. So the body paragraphs, of course, this makes up the longer part of the essay. This is the meat. This is where you make your argument. You will end up, or you should end up, with one body paragraph generally for each category that you have. If you set up your thesis statement using that X statement formula, which I really, really like, you will end up with one paragraph for each of those components of the thesis statement. One category for the X, one for the A, one for the B. So one for the counterpoint, and then 2 for the, to beef up your main point. So in my example that I was doing there, I'd have one paragraph where I talk about how there was a lot of continuity and a lot of the things changed, a lot of things didn't change. I'll talk about the proclamation of 1763. And I'll make an argument that, that was a different way of doing things, but the colonists dealt with it and reacted to it the same way they had everything else. And then I'd spend a paragraph talking about how the Stamp Act showed things had changed. And I talk about how the Stamp Act elicited that was a different way of doing things for Britain. That was the first time they used direct tax. And the way the colonists reacted to it was very different. Then I spend a paragraph talking about I think the other one was maybe Sugar Act. I don't know which one it was. Sugar Act or whatever, and how that was different, so forth, so on. Okay. Within the body paragraphs, within the body paragraphs, not within each one, but within the body paragraphs, you've got to have 2 specific historical examples, 2 specific pieces of evidence that are relevant to the topic of the prompt. Y'all don't know how much easier this makes your life now that they have, in the past couple of years, done this and said that you just have to have 2 specific pieces of evidence throughout the entire body. Used to, you had to have as much as you possibly could. You had to put in as much as you could possibly cram in there. And, it was possible to have, 10 things in there, but because you were missing these 2, you would get serious point deductions. One of the things they wanted to change was to say, okay, let's give students an opportunity to get credit for what they know, as opposed to punishing them for what they don't know. So this only requires you to give 2 specific examples. So that means you can't just say, well, there were taxes. Okay, that's not a specific example. Stamp Act and then telling me about that, not just mentioning it, not just name dropping it and saying, hey, there was the Stamp Act, but talking about what that did and how that relates to my thesis, how that proves my point, in this case, again, using my example here, using that to prove my point, that changed things, that changed the relationship between the British government and the colonists. But I just have to have two. Most of the time, you're going to have more than that, but two is the minimum. So I encourage you to have as much as necessary, but you don't have to just name drop as much stuff as you possibly can. You don't have to just throw everything out there and throw all these facts out there, for the sake of trying to earn points. It's more about quality now than it is about quantity. So you have to use that evidence correctly, but you don't have to just, what I used to have to tell students was you just brought up everything you knew, but we don't do that anymore. Again, it must support the argument. Must support the argument. If I just say that the Stamp Act was passed and that put a tax on papers and they had to have a stamp on things and newspapers and playing cards and all that kind of stuff, and the colonists didn't like it, that would not be sufficient, okay? Because in that case, I'm not using it to support my argument. I've got to say all of that and then use it to support my argument that this represented a fundamental change. Again, it's the first time Britain used a direct tax. It's the first time the colonists, erupted in mass protest. They were united. They organized. They boycotted. They had congresses. All that kind of stuff. I've got to use it to prove a point. I can't just leave it there. And that's one of the biggest problems that I notice. It's that analyzation. A lot of you are really good at regurgitating facts. But when it comes to the analysis, that's where you fall short, because that's where you can't just get that out of a book. That takes this. It takes historical reasoning. You've got to think like a historian. You've got to use it to a purpose. So in these body paragraphs, they're going to be looking for the evidence, but they're also looking for your demonstration of the particular historical reasoning skill that's being assessed on that particular essay. So comparison, causation, continuity, change. Making sure that you're doing that you're actually using that evidence to demonstrate and highlight those particular skills. And it must demonstrate complex understanding. Now that sounds kind of simple, but it's actually a little bit difficult. It's a little hard to explain, and it's also a hard point to get. Again, we'll see the rubric in a moment, and you'll know what I'm talking about. But one of the points on the AP exam essay comes from what they call complex understanding. And there's lots of different ways that you can demonstrate that. However, that is a point that, according to the people that write the exam and all this sort of stuff, it's a hard point to get. This is where you show you understand, that there's conflicting evidence, or you understand that different perspectives, different points of view. You understand that it's not just this or that there's gray areas. Again, it's a little bit hard, well, not hard to describe, but you can read more about it on your rubric. But again, this is the hardest point to get, and this is the one that they reserve, and they, tell us as teachers to reserve to those best, very, very, very best essays. One of the ways it's been described to me multiple times is this is the wow factor. This is the wow factor that just kind of blows the reader away. It's like, wow, that was really great. That was an interesting point. I never read that and thought about it that way. Where you really demonstrate that you know more than just what you read out of a book. Again, it's a hard point to get, and I'll talk more about it in just a second. So let's look at an example, okay? A couple of other things that body paragraphs need to have that I did not list on your little handout there, because it just kind of should be common knowledge by this point. One is a good topic sentence. You've got to have a good topic sentence for each body paragraph. I find this is one of the most commonly overlooked things in my students' writing, and it's one of the easiest fixes if you will make sure that you have a good topic sentence that relates to your thesis. And that's probably one of the most common comments that I will write on a lot of people's papers. So, for example, still using that same example about the relationship between the American colonists and the British government. Okay, this is my second paragraph. I'm going to say the passage of the Stamp Act demonstrates a major change in the relations between the American colonists and the British government after the French and Indian War. So that's a good, strong topic sentence. I'm introducing my topic, Stamp Act, and how it relates to the thesis. I'm using this to prove that the relationship was different, that things were fundamentally changed. The Stamp Act was a direct tax on the American colonists paid directly to the British government. This was unlike previous taxes. So again, I'm showing the change here. I'm showing what's different. This is the historical reasoning skill. This was unlike previous taxes that were enacted by colonial legislatures. Furthermore, the colonists massed demonstrations of protest against the Stamp Act, such as boycotting British goods and using the slogan "No taxation without representation" and general non-compliance with the law shows that the relationship had become quite strained. So I got my evidence there. I'm talking about Stamp Act, but I'm not just leaving it there. I am using it to prove a point. I'm saying this proves that something changed. Something was different. The colonists were no longer ignoring British authority, but directly challenging it, saying they're not just pretending it didn't happen. They are out in the streets and protesting this, and claiming it was illegal for the British government to assert authority over them at all. So it's got the evidence, and it's got what I used to call that interpretive commentary, the analysis, where you explain and demonstrate that historical reasoning skill. Okay? All right, let's look at the conclusion. Post-contextualization is a fancier word for that. So going back to body paragraphs for a moment, here is the biggest, if I can name lots of problems that I see consistently over the years in students writing. But if I had to pick the number one thing, it's a lack of content knowledge. If you don't know your content, if you do not know the information, you will not do well here. You just won't. Whether you have a book to look at or not, I don't allow you to use notes when you write, but even if I did, if you're just copying stuff out of the notes, that won't be sufficient, okay? Notice you couldn't have just looked at your notes and written about the Stamp Act and that had been sufficient. You would have had to really understood that concept, and you would have had to really understood and been comfortable with making that argument that, in my case, the argument that I was making, that it represented a fundamental change. So again, you have to know your content. You have to know it forwards and backwards and sideways and diagonal. You can't kind of know it, you got to know it. Because that is the basis for analyzing. If you don't know it, if you don't have the recall knowledge, you can't analyze. But again, recall knowledge won't get it. So you can't just memorize stuff and not truly get it. You got to be able to wrestle with it. Okay, then in the end, we'll of course have a conclusion, and one of the things they'll be looking for in the conclusion is what we call post-contextualization. That's sort of the opposite of contextualization. If contextualization was, here's the backstory, here's what happened before, now here's where we are. The post-contextualization is where we go next. Okay, so this continues the thought of the essay into the conclusion. It includes some information that comes after the essay topic, generally about 20 years. You could go a little further, but I would be careful about going any further beyond maybe 50 years or so. So this is, you know, how on some TV shows, they'll start with the recap. Here's what happened previously on such and such. That's your contextualization. And then when they end the show, and then sometimes they end it on a cliffhanger, then they'll say, oh, in the next episode, stay tuned for this. Next week on such and such, here, they show you some scenes. That's what's happening here. You're kind of giving a little bit about what's going to happen next. So, for example, this question that I've been looking at, and again, it should be relevant to the essay topic. You cannot just go off on a tangent about something that's going to happen 100 years later or something that's not relevant, okay? So you can't be writing about the American Revolution and then say, and then, you know, we had the war on terrorism. I mean, that wouldn't be relevant. So you can't do that. It's got to be relevant to that time. This is where you also want to avoid, and there'll be a note about this later, another common thing people want to do is just go, and this made the United States the nation it is today and give us all these little happily ever after things. We don't do that. So you stick close to the time period. So as I've been looking at this example of, you know, the relationship between the British government and the American colonists, what's a big thing that's soon going to happen because of all that? What's something that's going to happen because this essay I've been working with here has had to do with the relationship between the British government and the colonists? Yeah, eventually we're going to see a fight for independence. That'd be a great thing to put in my post-contextualization, to say we get this change in relationship, and that's eventually going to lead to this. Okay, that's how I could finish this up, which is what I did here. So here's my post-contextualization that I wrote for this one. Although the American colonists and the British government had always been quite distant, the French and Indian War still resulted in major changes in their relationship. So that's kind of a reiteration of my thesis, okay, sort of restating that. Here's my post-contextualization. What comes next? The subsequent attempts by the British government to exert authority over the colonies led to uprising and discontent and ended the peaceful period where the British government and American colonists were content to ignore each other. These resentments and disputes would continue, eventually leading to the outbreak of violence and the belief amongst many American colonists that the time had come to separate from Britain completely. So I just very briefly went into, and this is going to keep on going, and eventually we're going to get a movement for independence, and that's it. Okay, so I'm kind of giving set the scene for what's about to come next. All right. Okay, now a few other things that you've got there in your packet that I want to call your attention to. I believe that's the last thing I'll have to write down. Am I right? Okay, but there's still some more stuff in there. Let's take a look at it. So let me get mine or find one. So first of all, you've got there a let's use this one. And you also have the rubric in here that I want to show you. Okay, so the next thing that's on there, I just want to run through some of these. Yes. Please skip one. That's the contextualization? That's thesis. Oh no, okay, it's a repeat, that's what it is. Yeah, this is the same thing. That's just a mistake. That's one of those ought to be removed. So yeah, don't worry about that one. It's a rehash of the contextualization that I should have taken off. I didn't realize that was there. Okay, so look at this letter J here. The golden rules, some of the golden rules. I did not. I compiled this kind of from a list that some other teachers had made, but these are definitely things that I would agree with and stuff you need to really be aware of, and make sure you read over these. And this first one here, this really is true all the time, and some of you will do a lot better if you will operate under this rule in here all the time. Assume that the reader, which most of the time is going to be me, knows nothing. Okay? Do not assume that we know anything. You've got to spell stuff out. So don't just say there were taxes and they were math. Who? Who are you talking about? What taxes? Where? When? You've got to spell that kind of stuff out. So do not assume that anything is known. Don't take it for granted that we know what you're talking about. You've got to be specific. I ought to be able to read your essay or your response, whatever it is, and know what the question was, even if I hadn't seen it, even if I didn't know what the question was. But I do know what it is. But you've got to write in a specific and intentional way as if I didn't know that stuff. Do not use unsophisticated language. Okay, we don't write like we talk. All right, we do not write like we talk. We should never write like we talk. We certainly should not write how we text and all that sort of stuff. But don't use words like stuff. Don't say things. Don't say there was taxes and stuff. They were mad and things. We don't talk like that. We've got to speak in an academic language. So you've got to get away from writing the way that you talk and the way that you text and the way that you converse. Make sure you're always answering the question. That's a common problem I see, is people just straying away from the question. Like with this example, you should be constantly asking yourself, I'm writing about this relationship and how it changed and how it stayed the same. So as it says there, keep your eye on the ball. I mentioned don't go for the happily ever afterisms. Don't go into, and this made America great, and this is what made us the great country that we are, and this sort of stuff. Get away from the little cheesy stuff like that. It's not relevant. It won't help you out. Keeping your conclusions narrow. Again, the post-contextualization. Keep it within like 20 to maybe 50 years. Don't go on the crazy stuff that's like a century later. You do need to use, quote, PC language, Native American, African American, things like that. Don't use words that would, even though they may not be necessarily, considered inappropriate, but make sure you stick to that, because that is how an academic would do it. So just use those kinds of words. Tenses, don't shift them. History's in the past, keep it there. So you should always be writing in the past tense. And don't shift your tenses around. That's good writing anytime. As I was saying a moment ago, never write conversationally. So we don't write how we talk or how we text. Do not talk directly or do not write directly to the reader. No rhetorical questions. So do not say things like, have you ever wondered about, or I'm going to tell you about, or those kind of things. Don't open it with, I did the American colonists rebel against Britain. Don't use those kinds of things. It's just bad, unsophisticated writing. Don't do that. Spelling and capitalization, do the best you can with it. Now, you're usually going to be writing in class on a time constraint, so I expect there will be some minor errors, and that kind of stuff won't count against you, but big things will. So make sure that you're careful with that. Stay crisp and professional. Write as an expert in the field. You have to think and write like a historian. 12 is about contextualization. 13 is about post-contextualization and justifying yourself. Make sure you are proving your point and justifying those conclusions. 14 kind of goes along with number 1. Identify your pronouns and use them sparingly. Be specific. Don't just say they, say the colonists. Don't just say them, say Britons. Use things like that very, very sparingly, because it can get confusing. It can easily confuse the reader as to who you're talking about and make it unclear whether or not you know who you're talking about. And it's also just not very sophisticated language. 15, interesting point. Do not inject yourself historically by using we when you really mean Americans of the past. So don't say we won the American Revolution or we protested against taxes. We were not there. We're talking about people 200 years ago. So you talk about colonists or Americans of the past or people of this time. Don't insert us into it because we weren't there. We're keeping it in the past. Overall, do not write about your writing. I cannot express enough. Do not ever, and there's no first person, ever, ever, ever. I don't know if that was on here, but that's a really big deal. Do not ever write in the first person. What do I mean by the first person? No I, no me, none of that, ever, ever, okay? Not in here. There are times and places for that, but it's never in this room, okay? We never write in the first person at all. So there's never an I think the colonists should have done this, or I believe that Britain was wrong. We don't do that. Take ourselves out of it. We just don't say that. No opinions. It's a position, but it's not an opinion. That's why I don't like using the word opinion, because it tempts you to want to write in the first person, to say I think and I feel and I believe, and we don't do that. So make sure you're not saying that. Please don't write anything like I'm going to tell you about this essay is about. Have you ever wondered about? That's just all bad writing all the time as well, and it uses first person. Lastly, let's take a look at this. This is the rubric that, or it's a version of the rubric, the one that I'll be using. I didn't develop this, but it's a very good rubric for the LEQ. And it breaks down where the points come from. Now, you'll notice out of 6 points, that's not very much. Well, on the AP test, they make it out of 6 points, and then there's all these percentages and this complicated math. So this is how I'm going to use the rubric. But then when this goes in the grade book, I will translate that to something else. So I'll make it like maybe out of 60 points or something. And then if you got a 4 out of 6, it'd be a 40 out of 60 in the grade book. But this helps you see kind of how you would stack up as far as the AP exam, and then there'll be an adjustment point-wise to make it count for more in the grade book, so it's not just out of 6 points. But you can see where the points break down. Notice you get a point for contextualization. You get a point for your thesis making, and this breaks down, again, the specifics about what those have to look like, what has to be there. You get 2 points for your evidence and support of the argument. Evidence is the factual stuff. So for example, providing specific examples of evidence relevant to the topic. In this example I was just doing, you could get that point by mentioning like Stamp Act and T Act, okay? That would be the evidence. The supporting an argument, that second one there, that would be using that evidence to actually make your point. An analogy I've heard used is if there's a hammer and nails on the ground and you just go, hey, that's a hammer and nails. Okay, that's providing the example. But then if you take that hammer and nails and build something with it, that's where you get the second point, by saying how that's relevant to your argument. Then you get points for the analysis and the reasoning, and then there's that complex understanding. This is the hardest point to get. This is the one that really gets, this is the essay that just kind of blows me away sort of a thing. This is the wow factor. This is a point I don't expect many of you will be able to earn right off the bat. It's going to take some of you a while. And having said that, I don't mean, oh, you can't get this point, don't worry about it, don't even bother with it. What I'm trying to say is don't be disappointed if you're not able to get that immediately. That is kind of the few and far between thing. That's kind of for the rare exceptions. That's the exception, not the norm, that you would earn that point. But that doesn't mean you won't do well. And there's plenty of people that don't earn that point that still might make a 5 on the AP exam. 5 is the highest score you can get. So don't get, I guess my point is don't get so bogged down in trying to earn that point that you miss everything else. Worry about the other ones first. Worry about the other ones, and then complexity can come as you get better at it. Okay, questions on that? All right. So now I'm going to assign you the essay that you're going to be writing next week. So let's switch gears here for just a second. Let me get this off.